Good evening. Welcome to Great Decisions tonight. I believe we're in our 12th year of Great Decisions. If anybody wants to argue that, but I'm pretty sure it's our 12th. Many years of doing these wonderful programs. First, I would like to thank the Franklin Public Library Foundation for their support. And they get their support thanks to help from the Jerome J. and Dorothy H. Holtz Family Foundation and Carol and Tom Donovan. Tonight's speaker will be talking about America and the world, Trump 2.0 foreign policy. Our speaker is Dr. Beth Dougherty, who is the Manger Professor of International Relations and Professor of Political Science at Beloit College. She received her master's and PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. She has chaired the Beloit College's International Relations program since 1996. And as you all know, probably, she's been a frequent speaker at our Great Decisions programs here at the library. So I'd like to thank Dr. Dougherty for coming and have her come.
Testing. Thanks everybody for coming. Can you all hear me? I can't tell if the mic is okay. Excellent. Great. So I was telling Jennifer earlier I had a very different talk planned for this, and 10 days ago it appeared that it would no longer be something that people might be interested in. But I'm still going to start with the John Eikenberry piece that was in the Great Decisions booklet. John Eikenberry is a really prominent scholar of global order, very interested in the question of why states cooperate with one another, right? So he was an excellent choice to write this particular piece for Great Decisions. Eikenberry's basic argument in his chapter is that Donald Trump has taken a wrecking ball to the global order, which we have long referred to as the liberal international order, which was established after 1945. It has multiple aspects to it. On the political side, the centerpiece is a collective security notion that is centered in the United Nations. The idea was that you could deter aggression if states thought that everyone else in the community would come out against them. Multilateral institutions and multilateral decision-making are a prime feature of the liberal international order. Free trade and open markets, and the UN's counterpart on the economic side, of course, is the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. There was a real commitment, especially after the collapse of communism in 1991, to spread democracy and human rights, at least partially because we have what is as close to an iron law as anything out there in political science, which is democracies do not go to war with one another. They go to war with non-democracies, but the more democratic states you have in this system, the lower the possibilities are that there will be global conflict. The US was the architect in many ways of the liberal international order, and the US has been at the center of the liberal international order. It's been the guarantor of this. The US has had many benefits that have accrued to it as being basically the global hegemon, right? An international order that was largely set up by the United States to fulfill American interests. As Eikenberry notes, great powers typically don't destroy their own international orders, but that is precisely what the Trump administration has been doing. And this is not simply a disruption or an erosion. This isn't the global order is going to snap back when a new American administration comes to power. As Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said at the Davos talk not too long ago, this isn't a transition, it is a rupture. And I will simply note that at times of transition for global order, they tend to be highly unstable with a great risk of conflict. Our allies find themselves disoriented and shocked by the way in which the United States is abdicating its position as leader of the liberal international order. The Trump administration has rejected multilateralism, it has rejected alliances, it has rejected the defense of human rights and democracy, it has rejected international law and international norms. At a very basic level, the United States has lost the trust of its allies and many people around the world who at one time relied on the United States' generosity. So the big question for many states now is, can you rely on the United States? Can you rely on the US's word when it signs an international treaty? The Trump administration has embraced unilateralism, coercion, transactionalism, and displays really a breathtaking disregard for global rules, including fundamental ones like the prohibition on the use of force, except in self-defense, which is the cornerstone of the collective security system set up after World War II, as well as the laws and rules of war, which we have been able to see in the way in which the U.S. has been conducting boat strikes in the Atlantic and the Pacific, around South America and the Caribbean, and certainly in the case of the war with Iran. This is not normal, and I think sometimes we have normalized what is going on, and it just because things happen so quickly, we get acclimated to them. But I'd just like to remind you how we went into war in the Middle East the last time. I cannot believe I'm going to say the war with Iraq in 2003 as an example of how the administration should have acted. Right? The Bush administration spent over a year trying to convince the American people that an invasion of Iraq was necessary for U.S. national security, so that by the time it actually happened, everybody understood what those reasons were, right? That Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and was lying about it, and that it had ties to international terrorism, to Al-Qaeda. Okay? Every Sunday, the administration sent out its spokespeople onto the Sunday morning news shows to convince Americans to build support, right? They sent Colin Powell to the United Nations, right, to try to talk the UN in. They went to Congress. The Bush administration got an authorization for the use of military force and attempted to get a UN Security Council resolution, which would have given the blessing of the UN, although it was unsuccessful in that aspect. Right? It built a coalition of allies that were willing to go with the United States, although, again, they had to call this one the coalition of the willing, because there were so many fewer states that were willing to participate than had done in 1990 in Operation Desert Storm. This time, though, the president actually announced this in the middle of the night from the ballroom at Mar-a-Lago wearing a baseball hat, right? George W. Bush spoke from the Oval Office to tell people that the U.S. had gone into war. This 8-minute video has a very confused overall thrust to it. It's unable to articulate a clear rationale for why the United States is going to go to war with Iran. Right? Lays out a variety of different possibilities, but no clear measurement for how we might think about success in this war. I would just note, at the very end, he says, finally, to the great power people of Iran, when we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will probably be your only chance for generations. This is the moment for action. Do not let it pass. I would just note that several weeks before this, the Iranian people had been out in the streets against their own government, right? And the Iranian regime slaughtered hundreds of people, right? Trump himself said the figure could be as high as 33,000. The regime said they murdered 3,000 people in the streets, right? it's clear what would happen to the Iranian people to come back out into the streets against their regime. It was an irresponsible to call on the Iranian people to rise up in this way. We note Benjamin Netanyahu said the same thing earlier today. The US has a really bad track record of telling people, go out into the streets, the US will protect you. Hungarians in 1956 in Budapest looking for the United States, which didn't come, they got crushed by the Warsaw Pact. Shia and Kurds in Iraq in 1991, the US told them that the way to avoid the war was to overthrow their dictator. They took the United States at its word. The US chose not to intervene. Tens of thousands of Iraqis were slaughtered by the regime. The head of the law enforcement in Tehran today said, protesters should know their finger is on the trigger, right? Anybody comes out into the streets, they will do to them what they had previously done earlier this year. One of the downsides of not making a public address, of not trying to build public support for the war, is that in fact, most Americans, a pretty substantial majority of Americans, are against the war, right? The majority of Democrats and the majority of independents and even some Republicans do not approve of going to war with Iran, right? Over there, military action against Iran. Has the Trump administration clearly explained US goals? This poll was taken a few days after the fighting started. 62% said no, the administration had not done that yet. Wars are popular or have their highest popularity at the beginning. Wars don't get more popular over time, right? And so there was no rally around the flag effect when the US attacked Iran because the Trump administration fundamentally decided not to try to build a case for public support. So what I want to do is I want to look at the military aspects of this campaign. Then I want to look at Iran's response, think about the economic consequences, and then go back to thinking about what is the goal of this war? What is the political objective the use of US military force is attempting to achieve? The plan for the military strike against Iran has been in place for decades. This is US Central Command has had this on the shelf. They update it all the time. They run war games around this. They train around this. They knew how to go about doing this. They've been gathering the intelligence on Iran, for example. They know where the Iranians have their ballistic missiles and their ballistic missile launchers, for example. And the military campaign, its goal is to dismantle Iran's ability to project its military power beyond its borders. The very first day of the campaign, the US and Israel actually assassinated Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and a number of other senior leaders in an effort to sever command and control in Tehran and make it harder for the Iranians to retaliate against the US, Israel, and as it turns out, the Gulf states. So the US is attempting to go after the ballistic missiles. The JCPOA agreement the Obama administration negotiated in 2015 dealt with the nuclear program. And one of the major criticisms of the JCPOA was it did nothing about ballistic missiles. This has been a long-standing concern. The Iranians have about 3,000 short and intermediate range missiles. It has nothing that could get anywhere close to the United States, but it can hit as far as Israel, for example. Again, the United States knew where most of these targets were. They think that they've done an excellent job of taking them out. They wanted to destroy the Iranian Navy, right? Most of Iran's Navy has been sunk. The first use of a torpedo since the end of World War II happened off the coast of Sri Lanka when the United States blew up an Iranian ship that was there. The US has also, and Israel, had been going after the assets of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, as well as the internal security institutions. So these are looking at this one on the the left side, is looking specifically in one province, right, at the internal security where they have hit, right? So it's not just missiles and missile strikes. They're going after law enforcement as well, because it is a tool of repression of the Iranian people. Eventually, the assumption is they will go back and hit the nuclear sites, although, again, those have been very badly damaged in the 12-day war the previous year. The big open question about the nuclear sites is, how do you secure Iran's highly enriched uranium, which at this point is buried deep underneath the earth? Military believes that in order for it to secure it, right, that would require boots on the ground. And right now, that is not on the table. Right? The Israelis, rather, have actually started hitting Iranian refineries and storage facilities. That's the huge cloud of dark smoke that you saw over Tehran the other day. The U.S. military in general says the campaign is going well. Iran's ability to retaliate has dropped dramatically since the first couple of days of this war. The U.S. has virtual air supremacy over nearly all of Iran, which means as the Iranians try to move something from point A to point B, for example, the U.S. and the Israelis can see that, right? We can fly over Iran almost without fear, right, of being shot down by anti-aircraft death. So the military plan is going according to plan. This is exactly the way CENTCOM thought that this war would go. There are a couple of things to keep an eye on here. One is that the Iranians do not have to be right very often in terms of hitting something with their retaliation to actually do damage to the United States, right? We've already lost 7 U.S. service personnel. About 14 different U.S. facilities have been damaged in the Gulf, right, over the course of the fighting. Some of those have been diplomatic posts, but some of them have also been military facilities. Again, the U.S. has a massive naval base in Bahrain. It has a massive air base in the United Arab Emirates. It has forces stationed in both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. So the U.S. has a lot of bases and a lot of assets in this region. The cost of the war is substantial. And in fact, the reporting today was that it is higher than people had initially realized. The estimate is, well, in a briefing today, Congress was told by the Pentagon that in the first 6 days, the U.S. spent $11.3 billion on the war in Iran. That does not include the costs of the buildup and a lot of other things. That's basically the cost of the munitions, of keeping everything in the field, etc. Something that people are trying to keep an eye on with respect to the military campaign, and the virtually every military person that you hear interviewed about this is one of the questions that they're asked, which is munition stocks. Right? The U.S. has expended about $5.6 billion worth of munitions in the early stages of this war, and that may be a quarter to a fifth of all of the munitions that the United States has available. Now, it surged military forces, munitions, etc., all those kinds of things into the Gulf as the buildup, but those munitions came from somewhere else, right, in order to put them into the Gulf. And so not only do we need to keep an eye on what the U.S. is using in the Gulf, but also thinking about how quickly can it be replaced, where is it coming from, and how quickly can we replace the Israelis, who also, of course, are using mainly American equipment. There are always going to be mistakes in any military campaign, and the United States apparently struck the girls' school in Iran, killed nearly 200 people. Majority of them actually were children. Okay? The administration's initial response to the reports that it was the US that was responsible was to blame the Iranians. Right? But again, mistakes will happen, right? Civilians will be killed in war. So if the military campaign is going very well, I would just note and hold on to this because I'll come back to this strategic piece. Tactical brilliance cannot make up for strategic incoherence. The first rule of any military campaign is you must have clear political objectives, right? One of the things that sunk the United States in Vietnam was the US never lost on the battlefield, but it did not have a clear, coherent set of political objectives, right, that matched the military force that it was using. The US military also was brilliant when the US invaded Iraq in 2003, and that came to be called a catastrophic success because the political planning was so poor, right? The military did its job, but the political leadership had fallen down. So, in terms of Iran's response, right? Over the years, as CENTCOM has put its plan together, they've run lots and lots of war games, and virtually every person who I've heard who's been involved in those war games has said the same thing, which is every time they ran one of these war games, if the Iranians believed that they were in an existential war, if they thought regime survival was at stake, that they would lash out at the Gulf states. That should not have been a surprise that that would happen. That was actually what has been predicted, that it would go after civilian targets and energy facilities. It is clear that Iran now believes this is an existential crisis. Apparently, the reason that Ayatollah Khamenei was above ground with a lot of his advisors during the day at his residence, where everyone knew he was, is because the Iranians thought that the buildup of US forces in the Gulf, that we were going to go after their nuclear facilities again. They also assumed the US would bomb at night because that is when it traditionally does that. They didn't think the US would strike in broad daylight. So the Americans and the Israelis caught the Iranians by surprise. But by killing Ayatollah Khamenei, that was an immediate signal to the Iranians, this is an existential war, right? And then Trump, of course, some of his rhetoric about regime change, unconditional surrender, etc., made it very clear, right? And so for the Iranians, what are they trying to do? They want to drag the war out. They want it to go on as long as possible. They don't think that the US or the president have strategic patience, right? They want to pressure other states to pressure the United States to back off. They want to impose costs, right, on the region, again, as a way of trying to ensure that there's pressure placed on the United States to stop. Right? Again, the Iranians have lost much of their retaliatory capacity because their ballistic missiles have been significantly degraded. The interceptor air defenses that the US, the Israelis, and the Gulf states have in place have been extremely effective. About 90% of everything that the Iranians have thrown at the Gulf states have actually been intercepted, right? However, this is where we get to the one big disappointment of the military strategy, and that is the use of drones on the part of the Iranians. Okay? Everyone knew that the Iranians had drones. We were aware of how you could use them because the Russians have been using Iranian drones in Ukraine now for several years. The Ukrainians actually offered the Pentagon last year to give it tactical guidance about how to deal with drone swarms, and even to allow the US to purchase low-cost interceptor drones that the Ukrainians have developed. but the United States last summer did not take them up on that offer, right? Look, the Iranian and their drones only need to be right a few times to really impose a lot of costs on the Persian Gulf. The UAE has taken the brunt of the Iranian hits, right? At this point, we're down to about 13 ballistic missiles a day, and now it's about 50 drones a day in the UAE. But again, they've hit the airport, they have hit hotels, they have hit oil and gas facilities. Okay? A drone hit a major oil refinery in Saudi Arabia, Ras Tanura, on March 2nd. It struck this facility in Bahrain. Again, this is a Bahrainian refinery that it hit on March 9th. It struck the largest liquid natural gas plant in the world in Qatar on March 1st. Okay? Even though, again, you can see the Bahrainis and the Qataris have been very successful at intercepting or shooting down most of what gets thrown at them, but some stuff gets through, right? As a result of these strikes, Qatar and Bahrain have both declared what's called force majeure, which means the contracts that they were supposed to fulfill in terms of oil and liquid natural gas, they are not legally responsible to fill them, basically act of God, right? There's a war. After Qatar's liquid natural gas plant was hit, they actually shut down production. Iran has also been attacking vessels in the Persian Gulf, right? So this map is both, so the blue are what the Americans and the Israelis have hit against the naval facilities. And the red is places where the Iranians have hit. It does not include the 3 or 4 ships that got hit today, right? This actually was hit this morning, right, in the Strait of Hormuz. The other ships were all in the Persian Gulf. Okay? So this has put enormous pressure on the Strait of Hormuz, which at this point I think everybody is probably thinking, why do we have to keep talking about the Strait of Hormuz? Okay? It is incredibly narrow. Okay? It is about 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. So it's about 100 miles long. The shipping lanes at the top, like at the point, right, are 2 miles wide in each direction. And then there's a 2-mile channel in between them. So there's very little room to navigate through the Strait of Hormuz, right? And as you can see, you are very, very, very close to Iran, right? So it's very easy for the Iranians to strike ships that are moving through. Again, the Iranians do not need to sink a tanker for everyone to be afraid to move a tanker through the Strait of Hormuz. Okay? Why is it so important that people are able to get through the Strait of Hormuz? Because 30% of global seaborne oil trade goes through the strait, and 20% of the global liquid natural gas goes through. A great deal of it is going to Asia. That's why the Asia arrow is so much bigger than the one to Europe. So these maps show what the typical traffic was through the Strait of Hormuz. It's about 90 to 100 ships a day were going through before this happened. And then on March 4th, the day after the Revolutionary Guard said they were going to blockade the strait, you can see there's nothing moving. Maybe 3 ships have gotten through recently. They're all Iranian, carrying Iranian crude headed to China, right? But basically, the threats that the Iranians have made against shipping, followed up by the attacks that they have launched against those boats, has meant that shipping out of the Strait of Hormuz, for all intents and purposes, has stopped. China and India are the ones that are most vulnerable because they rely most heavily on shipments of liquid natural gas and oil out of the strait. The problem that we have right now with respect to oil and natural gas is not a supply problem. It's not that there's not enough oil and natural gas. It's a transit problem. We can't get it out of the Gulf. So Qatar partially owns the world's largest natural gas field. So on the smaller map, that big red thing, which is practically the size of Qatar itself, that is the North Field. That is a liquid natural gas field, right? And so at Ras Laffan, which was attacked by the Iranians, that's what the Qataris cut down. There is a pipeline that goes from there to the United Arab Emirates and then out to Fujairah. And Fujairah is on the other side of the Strait of Hormuz. The problem with that is that it has a small capacity, right, in terms of how much you could put through it every day. And loading at the Fujairah port right now is very backed up because the Iranians hit there as well. So tanker traffic is very leery of having to go there, right? Basically, Qatar has been putting gas in storage, but it has very limited capacity to be able to do that. And so it is now what they call shut in, right? And it's shut down its facilities, right? I would also note, when you shut something like this down, you don't just like flip a switch and it comes right back on immediately. It takes a while to get things back to where they were, even once they decide that they're going to start production again. The other possibility for getting stuff out of the Gulf, not going through the Strait of Hormuz, is the East-West pipeline that belongs to Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia, about 5 million barrels a day goes through the East-West pipeline. It could go up to 7 million barrels a day. But then the problem is the transfer point. The port at Yanbu, where that pipeline ends up, can only load about 3 million barrels a day. And in the few days before the war started, it wasn't even at 2 million barrels a day, right? So the storage at Yanbu is going to fill up very quickly. Producers like Kuwait and Iraq are shut in. They don't even have any alternate pipelines as well. And the Iraqis have had to close down production. They're going to have to start cutting their refinery capacity. They just simply don't have the storage facility to be able to keep all of this oil, right? In the very early days of this, energy experts were kind of like, well, we're going to have to wait and see how this works out. The markets did not immediately react to what was happening. That all changed dramatically at the end of last week, right? So prices of oil, should put these in the other oil or the other order. You can see prices went as high as almost $120 a barrel on Monday. And they have since come back down. So it's at about trading at about $92 a barrel right now. But there are concerns that this could go as high as $120 or $150 a barrel if the blockage at the Strait of Hormuz is not quickly solved. And of course, the problem with that is now the Iranians are saying they're going to mine the Strait of Hormuz, which some of you may remember, the Iranians mined in the Persian Gulf in 1988. The U.S. escorted ships through, and in fact, on the very first trip, the U.S. escort ship hit a mine, right? And so insurance for tankers has gone through the roof, and most major shippers do not want to risk their very large tankers by sending them through the Strait of Hormuz. That's what's putting all this pressure on price. So we've seen gasoline prices go way up, diesel prices have gone way up, jet fuel prices have gone way, way up, right? And so by Friday, a lot of energy analysts were saying things like, this could be the earliest stage of the worst energy crisis we've seen since the early 1970s. Everybody is on very high alert because the Iranians are able to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed And that just simply means oil and natural gas are not getting out, right? Two responses to this are possible. One is you escort tankers through, and Trump threw that out at one point. In fact, I think the Secretary of Energy may have claimed the US escorted somebody through the strait and then had to take that down because it had not. The US Navy is busy at the moment, right, with offensive actions against the Iranians. So as long as the US is fighting, the US Navy can't be diverted to take tankers through the Straits of Hormuz. France has said it is willing to do this, and a lot of energy analysts think that the markets would feel more comfortable if it was a multinational force that was trying to escort tankers through the Gulf, right? It's not clear when, because the French have sent some forces to the Gulf, but it's not clear when escorting tankers might be able to start. The other thing is, in response to the tremendous spike in the price on Monday of this week, the International Energy Agency, which was formed after the 1973-1974 energy shock, it's a multilateral institution that has a strategic reserve of oil. And so they have agreed that they are going to release about 400 million barrels of oil from that strategic release, right? This is only the fourth time the IEA has done this kind of emergency relief. They did it after, the last time was after Russia invaded Ukraine. 400 million barrels a day sounds like a lot. It's 4 days worth of global supplies, right? The United States, which has a significant amount of oil that it is pledged to the strategic reserve, the US has about 415 million barrels. It would take about 2 weeks to start delivering that to market. So it is possible that they can start to move some more supplies, but there's not enough, right? If there's an extended closure in the Strait of Hormuz, the other thing is, if you deplete the strategic reserve, then it's depleted, right? I mean, there's a reason why it's why they keep it as a reserve and only do this in emergencies. It cannot sustain us for weeks on end if that is how long this actually continues to go through in the Gulf. Right. So that brings me to the political piece of all of this and the strategic incoherence of the administration's decision to go to war with Iran. Right? This was a war of choice. This was a war that was planned. The US knew what the timeline was, although it didn't share the timeline with its allies in the Gulf or in Europe. The military and intelligence analysts have believed for a very long time that if the Iranians thought their regime survival was at stake, that they would go after civilian targets in the Gulf and that they would shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Military advisors apparently told the administration's highest echelons this as the planning was taking place. They did not take it seriously because in the 12-day war last summer, there wasn't very much impact on oil markets. The Iranians didn't close down the Strait of Hormuz, right? But the Iranians didn't think the 12-day war was an existential war. It was against their nuclear facilities. It wasn't an effort to uproot the regime itself, which is what the Iranians are convinced, or the Iranian regime is convinced is happening right now, right? One aspect of this poor planning, when Iran attacks civilian targets in the Gulf, you have tens of thousands of Americans who work in these countries in the private sector, plus the diplomatic corps, plus the US soldiers that are there, plus people that were there on vacation. And the US did not have an evacuation program in place, right? Part of that is because of the massive cuts that the State Department has endured over the last year. All of the countries circled in red do not have a US ambassador named or nominated. So they're being run by a chargé d'affaires, right? So the diplomatic capacity to deal with this was definitely not as robust as it may have been a year or two ago, right? And for many Americans, they felt abandoned, right? They called the embassy, and the embassy basically told them, we can't help you, right? Was the message that they were, literally the message that was on their machine. How long is this war going to go on? Well, we don't know. The president has been all over the map on this, right? He said it could be 4 or 5 weeks. Then he said it wouldn't last that long. Then he said the other day that it was almost finished. He's called for unconditional surrender, right? Our allies, especially our Gulf allies, they don't know what the timeline for all of this is. There apparently was not planning for the Strait of Hormuz to be closed, even though that should have been an obvious risk, right? It took 48 hours before the administration had any kind of response to the fact that the Iranians had started going after international shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. What is the ultimate goal, right? That this is the strategy piece. This is the political coherence piece. What is the U.S. trying to accomplish by the use of military force in Iran? The administration has offered a number of different arguments. It was decapitation. They wanted regime change. It was all about the nuclear sites. It was about ballistic missiles. It was because the Iranians were planning to strike the United States. It was because Israel was going to strike Iran, and then Iran would strike the United States, so the United States needed to strike first. There's not a clear sense of what is going on here. Apparently, the administration believed that if they decapitated the regime, that more pragmatic leaders would take over in Tehran. That is not what most analysts would have said, right? The risk of regime change is always that you get something worse than what you already had. This is not Venezuela, which again, apparently was the analogy that the president was really focused on. You have a deeply, deeply entrenched regime in Iran, right? The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has, there's a parallel structure. You have a conventional military in Iran, and then you have the Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Revolutionary Guard Corps' entire reason for existence is regime security. It is elements of the IRGC that was responsible for the slaughter of all of those Iranian protesters in January 8th. The IRGC is more hardline than other elements of the Iranian regime. And in fact, when Ali Khamenei originally became the supreme leader in 1989, right, he wasn't as radical as he eventually became, right? He eventually becomes very tightly tied in to the IRGC. Most Iran analysts believe that the fact that Mujtaba Khamenei, the Ayatollah's son, was named as supreme leader in his place is evidence that the IRGC is running things in Tehran. They wanted their guy to take power, right? Mujtaba is believed to be a hardliner, perhaps even more hardline than his father. But also note, Ali Khamenei did not want his son to take over because it looked too much like a royalist regime, like the Shah's regime that they took down, right? To turn it from one person to somebody else in your family. But the IRGC was determined, right? And so they have put a candidate in place, right? That is more hardline than the previous regime, not the pragmatic person that the administration apparently thought that they might be able to put into place. Right? The IRGC has grown immensely powerful in Iran. It dominates its political institutions. It dominates its judicial institutions. It controls the media, and it controls the surveillance state in Iran. It is one of the most powerful economic actors in Iran. Every important economic sector in Iran, the IRGC is involved in. Banking, shipping, manufacturing, consumer imports, construction. The IRGC has got its fingers everywhere. It is deeply entrenched. The notion that an aerial campaign alone was going to bring about regime change in Iran was wildly optimistic. And that, I think, is the nicest thing that you can say about it, right? You have to plan for all scenarios, right? The most likely scenario of killing Ali Khamenei was that an IRGC hardliner was going to take control in Tehran, not that the Iranian people were going to be able to come out into the streets and overthrow this regime. They have overwhelming force lined up against them, right? And people that are willing to use that force. One of the reasons the Shah's regime fell in 1979 was because the Shah wasn't sure, ultimately, that if he asked the Iranian military to fire on the millions of people that were out in the streets, whether they would actually do it. So he hesitated to order that kind of use of force. The IRGC does not have doubts like that in Tehran. It was irresponsible to call for a civilian uprising. Then there's this question about, the president said, we're going to arm the Kurds, the Iranian Kurds. And then several days later, it was, well, no, we're not going to do the Iranian-Kurdish peace. Shouldn't they have worked that out from the very beginning? Also note, one of the reasons why they couldn't do the Iranian-Kurdish peace is because you cannot arm, train, equip a military force in a couple of days. This is the kind of thing you would spend months, if not years, cultivating a force to be able to do this. It was also clear Turkey was not happy about this. It's not clear the Iraqi Kurds were happy about this, right? And so that was just another misstep, another sense of, well, does the administration actually have a plan? It keeps coming up with these ideas, but it doesn't really seem to know for sure what exactly it is that it wants. And that gets directly back to this question about the timeline. So moving forward, I think there are a number of questions that we need to be thinking about. What happens if US and Israeli objectives diverge? Right? The Israelis are doing this for their own reasons. What if the Trump administration wants to stop bombing, but the Israelis want to consider or want to continue, right? What if the Iranians decide they're going to keep fighting a low-intensity war, whether the US is firing or not? It is entirely possible that the regime will continue to lob projectiles into the Gulf, that it will try to go after American forces in the Gulf, right, on the low level. How long can the president sustain an unpopular war, especially if an energy crisis hits, right? What if the Iranian people begin to perceive this war not as a war on the Iranian regime, which most of them detest, but actually a war on Iran itself as a country? The rumors about arming the Kurds fed into this sense as maybe what the Americans really want is chaos. Maybe they want civil war. Maybe they want Iran to break up. Going after, as the Israelis did, domestic storage facilities, right? Or if they start to go after oil infrastructure, that might be another sign that the Iranian people take as, this isn't just about the regime, this is about us, right? And then any goodwill the United States might have with the Iranian people is going to evaporate. Right? What happens if this expands? It's already expanded into Lebanon, right? In fact, the worst of the displacement is happening there. UNHCR estimates that almost 780,000 people are displaced in Lebanon, and another 92,000 are refugees. They crossed the border into Syria, right? Hundreds of people have already died in Lebanon. Of course, you have about 1,300 people who have died in Iran, and several dozen people in the Gulf, right, as a result of this. The war in Lebanon could continue even if the fighting in Iran stops. And then lastly, I think it's important to remember, military action can have a really long tail, right? The US overthrew the Iranian regime in 1953, and that is why the Shah's regime fell in 1979. There is a direct connection. Why were people chanting death to America in 1979? Because the Iranians blamed the United States for overthrowing a democratically elected government and putting the Shah back on the throne. They blamed the Americans for the repression, right? The Shah had one of the most brutal secret security services of any country in the Middle East at that point. They blamed the Americans, right? So from 1953 to 1979, there were no consequences, but the bill eventually did come due for the United States there. The Reagan administration bombed Libya in 1986. The Libyan retaliation for that was the bombing of the airplane that went down over Lockerbie, Scotland, several years later. Right? So we may not be able to see consequences now, but there could be serious consequences months or even years down the road when the Iranians or one of their allies decide to retaliate against the United States. So I'm going to leave it there. Ask, do people have any questions, any comments? I would be happy to take those.
Excuse me. You mentioned in the beginning about the original plan that Europe had generated with Iran. I forgot the initials for it, where Iran was going to stop producing, upgrading uranium enrichment, and the United States didn't sign in on that. Obama couldn't get it through one of the houses, whatever it was. But I remember it was more, the U.S. objection to it was more that the Iranians, they didn't really have the ability to check that they weren't enriching the uranium. And what I had read also was that they actually had proceeded to enrich. And the biggest problem, the biggest scary thing about this whole war is if it had gone a different way and we didn't have the war and they finished nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. I mean, I grew up, there were five nuclear powers. There's 8 of them now. Do we want Iran to be the 9th? That's just my comment.
So it's the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was the nuclear framework deal that the Obama administration negotiated with the Iranians. It actually did go into effect. The JCPOA was still in place when the first Trump administration came into office, and Trump is the one that withdrew the United States from the JCPOA. He had complained about it the entire time he campaigned, but at the time that he withdrew the U.S. from the JCPOA, the U.S. intelligence community said Iran is abiding by the agreement, right? And so there were strict limits on how much uranium the Iranians could enrich. There were limits on how many centrifuges the Iranians could have. The International Atomic Energy Agency was allowed to do inspections of some Iranian facilities. that deal was in place and it was working. It didn't get everything people would have wanted because, again, it did not deal with the ballistic missile threat. But on the nuclear front, the JCPOA was working. And the US is the one that ripped it up. The Iranians actually did not begin violating the JCPOA for months after the US withdrew, because I think they were trying to see if maybe things could be, if this framework could come back, if there was some way to negotiate a new agreement, etc. But as the administration pursued what it called a policy of maximum pressure on the Iranians began to take a series of steps. They didn't do it all at once. They escalated, right? And over time, eventually all the elements of that framework basically were gone. But the Iranian nuclear program was being contained by a diplomatic agreement that the first Trump administration decided that it did not want to abide by. That also is a reason why it has been so much harder to get a subsequent nuclear agreement with the Iranians because, and it's a very fair point, Iranians are like, guarantee that you will actually abide by the agreement because you're the one that ripped the agreement up. We actually were doing what we were supposed to, right? And so, yes, it would be dangerous for the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon. Bombing Iran last year in the 12-day war, the war right now, these were wars of choice, and they were also the outcome of earlier choices, right? There were different paths that could have been taken that were not taken. I would know, Bibi Netanyahu has wanted to take out the Islamic Republic regime for as long as he has been in public life in Israel, right? Some of you might remember in 2012, there was all kinds of public talk about whether or not the Israelis were going to bomb Iran. The Israelis wanted the Americans to go with them, and the Americans said no in 2012, right? And so, for Netanyahu, he has his own particular set of concerns, but this has been a long-standing goal of his politically.
Why does Netanyahu want to do that?
He sees Iran as an existential threat to Israel, though.
Religiously, or?
I'm sorry?
Religiously, or what? I don't understand.
Because the Islamic Republic, they refused to accept Israel's right to exist, right? The death to Israel. And then Hezbollah, in particular, is backed by the Iranians. Hamas has some Iranian backing. So Israel was being surrounded and pressured by Iranian-backed proxy groups, right? And of course, the instability in Lebanon with Hezbollah there is that poses a constant threat to Israel's north border. Again, I would just note this. Again, long tail for things. Where did Hezbollah come from? The Israelis invaded Lebanon in 1982. They did not just go to the Litani River, as they had done when they invaded Lebanon in 1978. They went all the way to Beirut. And that is the point at which the Shia population, which is the majority in Lebanon, coalesced around Hezbollah to force the Israelis to leave Lebanon. There was not a Hezbollah before that. There were armed Shia groups, but they weren't necessarily directed at the Israelis. So, law of unintended consequences, with military action, you have to be very careful.
It's interesting, Professor, that you have taken the position of the opposition to the Trump administration. Most of your presentation has been related to the arguments against this particular action. I had hoped this evening that I would have heard more of a balanced presentation of what's going on in Iran right now.
So I did tell you, the
No.
military
No,
campaign has
you
been
didn't.
brilliant.
No, you didn't. You
That's
gave
exactly
all
the
of the
words that I
arguments.
said.
You gave all of the arguments why this was a bad issue, a bad presentation by the president. You gave very few of the issues that have been happening in Iran over the last 40 years against the United States and by the people of Iran against their own government. You glossed over that. And that's fine, that's your position. But you're clearly on one side of this, and you did not present a balanced view of what's going on and where we're going.
So
You
I
are
think maybe
right.
you misunderstand the notion of balance, right? There's not a 50-50 split on everything, right? Some policies are misguided, right? Some policies are poorly thought out. Calling that out, look, I have been critical of U.S. military action in the Middle East, whether it has been Democratic presidents or whether it has been Republican presidents. As somebody who has studied this region, right, for nearly 40 years, what I have seen is a series of mistakes by U.S. political leaders, right? George W. Bush administration did not plan for the day after in Iraq. There is no way to spin that. There's no way to gloss that. There's no way to say that's great. Donald Trump has not built a case for war to the American people. And the majority of the American people agree with me on that position, right?
No, I don't agree with you on that
That's
at
what
all.
the public-
It's not right.
That's what the public opinion polls show.
She showed the numbers.
I will go back.
Okay. One, I appreciate what I think was a very factual, informative presentation. I appreciate that. I think many of us in this room do. My question is, I think often in our comfort as Americans, we make the mistake of assuming the rest of the world thinks and behaves like us. And I guess maybe you could comment on how does, whether you're talking about the administration or the public perception or the biases involved, how do we understand that different cultures come from different perspectives, make different interpretations, both proactive and reactive? Does that make sense?
So you're asking how does this impact how other people view the United States?
No, I'm asking how do we put ourselves in their shoes in terms of, if the question is how do I, the history of Iran does not perceive this the same way that we do. We're looking at the short term. They're looking at the long term. Do we really understand with their culture and their history, how do we as Americans understand where they're coming from, both culturally and politically and historically?
Well, I mean, that's what, professionals in the diplomatic corps, professionals in the military, in academia, in think tanks, people will spend decades, right, immersing themselves in a particular place, a particular region, right, so they can answer some of those questions, right? So that, this is why people can interpret the choice of Mujtaba Khamenei as supreme leader, right? Of saying, okay, you know what that is about? That is the IRGC pushing forward, making sure that it takes control of the regime. You never have perfect information, right? You can never accurately predict every consequence, right? What you have to try to do is identify the most likely consequences, right? And plan for those. So I say, we have a huge cadre of people in the U.S. diplomatic and military circles who have devoted their professional lives to the Persian Gulf, right?
Maybe the shorter question would have been, why don't we listen to the experts?
Oftentimes, administrations don't ask. Sometimes they take a contrary view, right? And so again, apparently in this case, you had military advisors who told the administration that a military action in Iran could threaten the Strait of Hormuz, which would drive up the price of oil. But they discounted that because they thought last year that didn't happen, so it wouldn't happen this time. But these were two fundamentally different military campaigns, right? And so, you know, oftentimes this is what intelligence does after there are failures. You go back and you figure out, well, how did this happen, right?
I just wanted to make a quick reminder that these programs can have topics that are can get very heated, but we always need to show respect to our speaker and also the people asking the questions. So if you could abide by those rules, I'd appreciate it.
Could you comment on Russia's role right now in their support of Iran?
So the Russians released a statement where they congratulated Mustafa Khamenei as, as the new supreme leader. The Russians have apparently been sharing intelligence with the Iranians so that the Iranians can strike at U.S. forces in the Gulf. The Russians are actually benefiting in some ways from this because there are still sanctions on Russian oil and gas related to the war in Ukraine. But India, which is under really heavy pressure because it doesn't have a lot of storage capacity. The Chinese have got a huge storage capacity and big strategic reserve. India doesn't have that. And so the administration relaxed some of the sanctions on Russia specifically for the sale of oil and gas to India itself. I think the Russians are suggesting that they could be the solution to Europe needing more oil and gas, but that would of course require the lifting of the sanctions. So neither the Russians nor the Chinese have really kind of put themselves wholeheartedly behind the Iranians. I mean, for the Russians right now, it's mainly been diplomatic support and intelligence sharing. They're not really in a position to share weapons with the Iranians. It's the other way around, right? The Iranians are sending their drones to the Russians so the Russians can use them in Ukraine.
This isn't exactly what you're talking about, but I just keep thinking about the effect on the environment when we bomb and stuff, and how much we're destroying, and how it's going to have an effect on humans.
So the biggest environmental threat right now from all of this is bombing oil facilities. Right, I'm sure most of you saw those pictures in Tehran after the storage refinery was hit and the huge black smoke. It rained later in the day in Tehran, and it was black rain. Right, it left like an oily, slick residue on everything. That kind of smoke in the air is very bad for anybody who has any kind of respiratory issues, or for children, or for the elderly. So what they're basically, for people in Tehran, is like, go inside and keep your windows and doors closed. Try to seal them as tightly as you can, because the air quality there is dreadful, right? Iran is in the midst of a much larger environmental crisis, a lot of it of its own making, with respect to water resources, right? The Israelis hit a desalinization plant in Iran. The Iranians hit a desalinization plant in Bahrain. And there are real concerns, right? If the two sides begin to target water facilities because of how water poor this entire area is. But yes, there will be immediate environmental effects that if more oil infrastructure is set on fire. You might remember Saddam Hussein set all of Kuwait's oil fields on fire when he withdrew in 1991. It took months to cap all of those wells and stop all of the fires.
I have a question. So what can we infer in terms of midterm elections? Like, how will this altercation in this war affect the Trump administration or during the midterm election, and what can we infer the outcomes to be in terms of popularity rates and all that?
So I think the big thing will be, again, how long does this go on, and how long is production shut in the Strait of Hormuz, right? Because if there's enormous upward pressure on gasoline, on jet fuel, on diesel, on home heating oil, then that is going to take a toll for most people, right? A lot of Trump's support in the last election was because people thought that he would improve their economic situation, that he would bring prices down, bring inflation down, but the war is doing the opposite. Now, we're 7 months out. Is it 7 months, 8 months out from the midterm elections? And that, again, gets back to this question of how long is this going to last, and that we don't know. But it definitely could have a negative impact if it means that there are inflationary pressures in the U.S., if the price of gas goes up in the summer, etc.
We know how polling in the United States, popularity or lack thereof of the war. How are the other countries that have been hit polling? Do we know? The reason I ask is somebody's going to get punched in the mouth. Somebody's going to take a massive, massive hit. And it'll be really interesting to me to see how that country, whether it be us or another, hang in there when that eventually happens.
So we don't have any good sense of that. I mean, there's almost no real polling data that would come out of the Persian Gulf because they're all politically repressive states. Their regimes don't care what their population thinks, right? One interesting consequence of what is happening here, though, is the degree to which the Persian Gulf states, in particular the UAE and Qatar, have kind of billed themselves as central points in a global economy, right? They're transportation hubs. They want to be financial hubs, that expats can come and live there and you can have a good life and you can make a lot of money, right? 90% of the population of Qatar and 90% of the population of the United Arab Emirates are expats. Only 10% of their populations are citizens. One of the things that Iran's campaign has done is shattered people's sense of safety. And so something to think about moving forward is how comfortable, I mean, again, how long does this go on? The longer this goes on, the more potential damage there is to this very carefully crafted strategy the Gulf states have been pursuing to diversify their economies by kind of pitching themselves as these global hubs. But people went there because they felt like they were safe, and now they're not safe, right? People may have thought, well, if anything bad happened, I can always get out easily. Well, now they found out, no, they can't, right? Because the Dubai airport was hit the other day. Flights have been very, very difficult. That is something, again, if one of the Gulf states takes a big hit to one of its civilian, to a big hotel, or the airport takes a direct hit, etc., those are the kinds of consequences the Gulf states will be thinking about. Is that's a much larger political and economic project for them.
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. My daughter brought me come here. She's a junior at Franklin High School. And I was telling her that I really want to wise up and get a little bit more savvy when it comes to like our politics. So thank you. The information was great. My question, it feels like the rules have changed, how we engage with each other, how we engage with other countries. The rules have changed. And so my question is, they say China, there are 4 pillars of strength. There's China and America. Uprising is India. Russia thinks they're in here, but they're not, but they're there. So my question is, what does power look like going forward with the rules changing? And specifically with us, since those 3 are near each other and we're kind of over here, with our relationships, have changed with Canada and our European allies and what's going on in Latin America. Like, what does our position look like in the future? What does the game look like going forward?
So that is a question that is going to keep academics and think tanks busy for years. I mean, that is when Eikenberry wrote this piece, obviously the war hadn't happened. So he was not thinking about that when he did this. But there has been a great deal of discussion ever since the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2022 about the liberal international order and the pressures that it was facing. Some of them external. China and Russia don't necessarily always abide by the rules. Obviously, they're not on board with the democracy and human rights part of this. The Russians were violating a lot of the laws and norms of war. And so there's been huge concern over the last several years that these very carefully built up rules that govern the use of force. I mean, war, people die in war. That's the way it is. But you can try to make it less bad. But the Russians have been violating those kinds of things with impunity in Ukraine. So there has already been a lot of upset and discontent. And that is why at the Davos meeting a couple months ago, when the Canadian Prime Minister gave this talk where he said, this isn't a transition, it's a rupture. We have to stop pretending that the liberal international order is coming back, because it's not. And nostalgia is not a strategy, he said, right? We need to think about how do we move forward in a world where the United States is no longer playing the role of guarantor, right, of the liberal international order. So we are in a time of tremendous flux at the international level. It's not clear what it looks like on the other side. Whose rules are going to be in place to govern the international community? Like right now, the UN is saying it is going to run out of money in July because the US is not paying its dues, right? A lot of multilateral institutions are under enormous pressure because the US has withdrawn from them. So again, since the end of World War II, Western democratic countries and the countries that have been allied with them have used multilateralism as a tool to manage global crisis. That has really taken a very hard hit. So, I mean, that is a fabulous question. And like I said, lots and lots of people are going to write lots and lots of stuff about that over the next number of years.
First of all, that was the best question of the night. I'm serious. I think one of the things that both your presentation and also some of the reactions here, unfortunately, have unleashed the professor in me, so forgive me for a minute. Just one observation about your question, because I honestly agree that we are at a time that we know nothing about what is going on. And I think that question we got about why don't we listen to the experts is one where there are 2 parts to this. First of all, I think sometimes we don't understand how hard experts work at understanding their expertise. It isn't something you come up with on one time and you live with for the rest of your life. It's something you keep crafting over and over and over again. So you look at so much and so many sides in order to determine what you understand about a question like yours. And that leads me to suggest that I think we're at a time right now where we all need to work on our own expertise. How do we know what we know? It doesn't come easily. And the advice that I always gave my students when they first came into my doctoral classes was, I want you to pretend you're in kindergarten. Basically, as we address controversial subjects, I use Margaret Wheatley's advice where she would say, are you willing to be disturbed? And what I would say is, you are only in a learning state when basically you feel very disturbed by everything that you're hearing or learning or getting inside of. But that is what the learning process is all about. And I would suggest we all need to go through that at this time particularly. And that leads me to my other recommendation. There are a couple of books that I ran across through recommendations of friends years ago. They're both by Scott Anderson, who is a historian journalist. One of them is called Lawrence in Arabia, and it is his documentation of the history of how all those countries in the Middle East came into being after World War I. And it was one of those books where all of a sudden I was gaining insight into a history that I didn't understand at all. It's a slog of a read, but it's worth doing. He recently released a second book that is called The King of Kings, and that is the story of the emergence of the Shah of Iran all the way to leaving Iran. And I think at this particular time, that too is another piece that puts something into place in a region of the world that very few of us have any concept of. So that's my advice tonight.
I know we have those books, or had those books in the library, so if you're interested, from a librarian talking. Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll wrap it up. There'll be some time if you want to speak with Dr. Dougherty before we close up. Yeah, 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming. Next week we'll be learning about tariffs. So with Dr. Pablo Toral. So I'm sure that will be another interesting topic.